The marble lobby of Ashford Tower caught the morning light like a cathedral designed by accountants who had discovered God in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. 42 floors of steel and glass rose above Manhattan's financial district, casting shadows that swallowed entire city blocks before noon arrived to reclaim them. The building had been completed 18 months ago, ahead of schedule and under budget, a monument to the woman whose name appeared on every lease agreement, every board resolution, every termination letter that human resources processed through their systems with mechanical efficiency. Vivian Ashford had inherited a company worth $300 million from a father who died believing she would destroy it. She had transformed that inheritance into an empire valued at $4 billion, and the tower that bore her family name stood as physical proof that the dead could be wrong about the living, that daughters could exceed the limitations their fathers imposed upon them. That ambition, properly applied, could reshape the skyline of the most competitive city on earth. She stood at the center of that lobby now, her heels planted on floor tiles imported from a quarry in Vermont that had ceased operations 2 weeks after fulfilling her order. Her blonde hair fell past her shoulders in waves that her stylist maintained every Tuesday and Friday morning, and her red dress cut angles sharp enough to draw blood from anyone foolish enough to stand too close. The color was deliberate, chosen with the same precision she applied to contract negotiations and hostile takeover defenses. Red commanded attention in rooms designed to render women invisible. Red announced authority in boardrooms where gray suits congregated like storm clouds. Red told every person who entered her building that the woman in charge had nothing to hide and everything to prove, that she had earned her position through combat rather than inheritance, that the softness her father had diagnosed in her had been surgically removed and replaced with something harder and colder and infinitely more useful. The board meeting waited for her on the 42nd floor, 12 men and women who controlled enough collective wealth to purchase small nations, but who still required her signature to access the future they believed they deserved. Vivian had not slept more than 4 hours in the past 3 nights, her body running on caffeine and cortisol, and the stubborn refusal to acknowledge weakness that had become her defining characteristic. The international contract spread across her desk upstairs represented 18 months of negotiation, 3 years of positioning an entire career, building toward a single signature that would either validate everything she had sacrificed or expose the fragility she worked desperately to conceal. Her competitors circled like sharks, who had tasted blood in quarterly reports and analyst predictions. Her board members sharpened their knives behind smiles that never quite reached their eyes. And somewhere in the machinery of her empire cracks were forming that she could sense but not yet see, fault lines spreading through systems she had believed were unbreakable. 8 years ago, Richard Ashford had summoned his daughter to his hospital room in the oncology wing of Mount Sinai, his body already surrendering to the cancer that would claim him within the month. The machines surrounding his bed had beeped their steady countdown while he delivered his final assessment of her capabilities, his voice reduced to a whisper that still carried the weight of absolute authority. "You are too soft for this world, Vivian. Too emotional. Too willing to see the good in people who will use that goodness against you. The company will eat you alive within 5 years, and everything I built will be sold for parts to competitors who understood what you never could." She had sat beside his bed and absorbed those words without visible reaction, her face composed into the mask she would wear to his funeral 3 weeks later, when 300 mourners watched to see if the new CEO would crack under the weight of grief and expectation. She had not cracked then. She had simply begun the process of proving him wrong by becoming him, adopting his coldness as armor, his ruthlessness as strategy, his inability to trust as the foundation of every relationship she would build in the years that followed. The elevator bank gleamed ahead of her, 6 doors arranged in perfect symmetry, each one promising escape from the lobby, where junior analysts pretended not to stare at the woman who controlled their careers and their mortgages and their children's college funds. Vivian had fired 14 people in the past month, restructuring the company, called it strategic realignment of human capital resources, the official memos proclaimed. The truth was simpler and uglier and lived in the space between her public confidence and her private terror. She was eliminating anyone whose loyalty seemed questionable, anyone whose eyes lingered too long on her mistakes, anyone who reminded her of the board members who smiled while positioning themselves to inherit what she had built. Fear made her cruel in ways she did not examine too closely. Exhaustion made her careless in ways she could not afford. The combination had transformed her into someone her mother would not have recognized, someone her younger self would have pitied, before learning that pity was just weakness, wearing a compassionate mask. 38 floors above the lobby where Vivian Ashford contemplated her empire, Grayson Mercer pushed a cleaning cart through corridors that most employees never noticed existed. The fluorescent lights hummed above him with the steady drone of machinery that never complained about overtime or requested health insurance or demanded the basic dignity of being acknowledged as something more than a function. He had been invisible for 14 months now, since the day he traded his military credentials for a maintenance uniform, and discovered that civilian life operated according to rules no combat training had prepared him to navigate. In the Army, competence determined survival and advancement followed demonstrated capability. In the corporate world, competence meant nothing without the proper title attached to your name, without the right connections lubricating your path, without the expensive suit hanging in the closet of the expensive apartment in the neighborhood where important people lived their important lives. His hands gripped the cart handle with the steadiness that 12 years of military service had drilled into his muscle memory until it became indistinguishable from instinct. Those hands had performed field surgery on wounded soldiers in conditions that would have sent civilian doctors into shock. Those hands had rappelled down cliff faces in Afghanistan, assembled weapons in darkness so complete that touch became his only reliable sense, held dying friends while helicopters that should have arrived failed to materialize against hostile skies. Now they wrapped around a mop handle for 8 hours every day, scrubbing toilets used by executives who earned in one quarterly bonus what he would accumulate in 3 years of uninterrupted employment. The irony did not escape him, neither did the necessity that made such irony bearable. His daughter needed stability more than he needed dignity, needed consistency more than he needed recognition, needed a father who came home every night more than she needed a hero who might not come home at all. The photograph in his wallet had been taken 6 months before Elise died during a weekend trip to the Jersey Shore that Willa still mentioned when memories surfaced without warning in the middle of dinner or bath time or the quiet moments before sleep claimed her. His wife smiled at the camera with the confidence of a woman who believed the future would unfold according to plans she had carefully constructed and regularly revised. Their daughter sat between them on a beach blanket, her blonde hair tangled with salt and wind, her blue eyes squinting against sunshine that seemed impossibly bright, in retrospect, impossibly innocent, impossibly unaware of the catastrophe approaching on a rainy Tuesday night 3 years in the future. Elise had been 31 years old when the drunk driver crossed the center line on Route 9 outside of Freehold. She had been coming home from a parent-teacher conference where Willa's preschool instructor praised their daughter's curiosity, her kindness, her remarkable ability to see solutions where other children saw only obstacles. The police officer who delivered the news had been younger than Grayson, his voice cracking over words he had clearly rehearsed but never learned to speak without visible pain. 3 years had passed since that night, but time moved differently when grief was involved, stretching and compressing in ways that defied the steady progression of calendar pages. Some mornings Grayson woke reaching for a body that no longer occupied the space beside him, his hand finding only cold sheets and the absence that had become his most constant companion. Other mornings he woke to Willa climbing into his bed, her small fingers tracing patterns on his arm, her voice asking questions about heaven and angels and whether Mommy could see them from wherever she lived now. He had learned to answer those questions without lying and without destroying the comfort she found in believing her mother watched over them from somewhere beautiful and peaceful and permanent. He had become both parents now, learning to braid hair from YouTube tutorials filmed by patient women, with steady hands mastering recipes Elise had made, look effortless attending school events where other children arrived with mothers and fathers, while Willa held only his hand, her grip tightening when the loneliness she could not name threatened to overwhelm her. Willa Mercer was 7 years old and small for her age, but fearless in ways that simultaneously terrified her father and filled him with pride so fierce it sometimes felt indistinguishable from pain. She collected broken electronics from neighbors who had given up on devices that manufacturers designed to fail when after warranty periods expired. She fixed them at their kitchen table in the apartment that was too small and too old and too far from the neighborhoods where her classmates lived in houses with yards and mothers who packed lunches in color-coordinated containers. Her tiny fingers moved with precision across circuit boards and tangled wires, her concentration absolute, her questions endless. She wanted to know how everything worked, from the toaster that burned their bread unevenly to the subway trains that carried them to school and back again. She had decided last month that she would become an engineer when she grew up, building things that helped people and never broke down and lasted forever. Grayson would work 1,000 janitorial jobs if doing so would make that dream possible for her. 40 floors above the corridor where Grayson Mercer contemplated his daughter's future, Preston Hale sat in an office that overlooked Manhattan with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who believed he had been denied something rightfully his and intended to reclaim it through whatever means presented themselves. The afternoon light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, highlighting the distinguished appearance he had cultivated over 47 years of careful self-presentation. His suit cost more than most Americans earned in a month, tailored to accommodate the slight paunch he blamed on client dinners, and his wife blamed on the bourbon he consumed each evening in quantities he never discussed with his physician. Preston had served Ashford Industries for 18 years, joining the company when Richard Ashford was still building the foundation that his daughter would later transform into an empire. He had been promised things during those early years, assurances delivered in private conversations that no recording device had captured and no witness could verify. Richard had looked him in the eye and spoken about succession, about legacy, about the importance of having someone competent, ready to assume control when the time came. The time had come 8 years ago, and the will that Richard's attorneys read to the assembled family and executives had contained no mention of the promises Preston believed he had been given. Everything went to Vivian, the daughter Richard had spent decades criticizing, as too soft, too emotional, too fundamentally unsuited for the brutal realities of corporate leadership. Preston had smiled at the funeral and shaken Vivian's hand and returned to his office to begin planning an alternative path to the position he believed he deserved. The planning had taken longer than expected, complicated by Vivian's unexpected competence and the board's gradual acceptance of her leadership. But circumstances had recently aligned in ways that made his original timeline irrelevant. $3 million in gambling debts had accumulated in accounts that his wife knew nothing about, owed to men whose collection methods involved hospitals and morgues rather than attorneys and courtrooms. The international contract that Vivian was preparing to sign would increase the company's value by 40%, making acquisition impossible for anyone operating with the limited resources Preston could access. He needed the contract to fail. He needed the company's reputation to collapse. He needed Vivian Ashford removed from her position before she completed the transformation that would render his plans permanently impossible. The phone on his desk displayed a number that existed in no directory and would be disconnected within hours of this conversation concluding. Preston lifted the receiver and listened to the voice on the other end confirm that the preparations were complete, that the systems had been modified according to specifications, that the timing would align with Vivian's predictable patterns of movement through the building she believed she controlled. Elevator 3, the voice reported, with the flat affect of someone discussing weather rather than potential catastrophe. The hydraulics have been adjusted. The safety systems have been compromised. She uses that elevator every day after board meetings, always the same one, always alone. Preston nodded, although the person speaking could not see him, satisfaction spreading through his chest like warmth from expensive bourbon. He ended the call without saying goodbye and returned his attention to the window, watching the city spread below him like a game board awaiting the movement of pieces that did not yet realize they were being played. Margot Sullivan had been Vivian Ashford's assistant for 6 years and had watched her employer transform from driven to obsessed with the gradual inevitability of sunrise. She scheduled meetings that Vivian forgot to eat during fielded calls, that Vivian was too exhausted to take, reorganized calendars that filled faster than they emptied with obligations that no single human could reasonably fulfill. Margot was 32 years old and had arrived at Ashford Industries with an MBA from Columbia and ambitions that had slowly recalibrated themselves around the reality of serving someone whose ambitions exceeded the available hours in any given day. She believed Vivian was brilliant visionary, even capable of seeing patterns in markets and opportunities that other executives missed entirely. She also believed the woman was destroying herself with systematic efficiency trading, sleep for productivity, and relationships for results, and health for quarterly reports that would mean nothing if she collapsed before delivering them. The company was thriving by every metric that mattered to shareholders and analysts, and the financial press that tracked corporate performance with the obsessive attention other publications devoted to celebrity gossip. Vivian Ashford was withering, her face thinner each month, the circles under her eyes darker, despite the expensive concealer that failed to fully conceal them, the sharpness in her voice more pronounced as exhaustion eroded the filters that professional behavior required. Margot wanted to say something, had composed speeches in her mind during late nights, when she stayed in the office waiting for Vivian to finish tasks that could not be finished because they regenerated faster than they could be completed. But she knew how Vivian would receive concern, knew that care would be interpreted as criticism, and compassion would be processed as condescension. So she said nothing and watched and filed away observations that she hoped would never become relevant and feared would become essential. Margot had noticed Preston Hale's behavior changing over the past several months, subtle shifts in his attention that triggered instincts she could not fully articulate. He watched Vivian during meetings with an expression that others might interpret as professional respect, but that Margot recognized as something else entirely, something calculating and patient and predatory. He asked questions during board discussions that seemed supportive on the surface but that planted seeds of doubt in careful soil. He volunteered for responsibilities that gave him access to systems and information that his position did not strictly require. Margot had begun saving copies of emails that seemed significant, storing them in personal accounts that the company's IT department did not monitor, building a record she hoped would prove unnecessary and feared would prove insufficient. She did not have evidence of wrongdoing, only suspicion refined through 6 years of observation and pattern recognition. But the suspicion grew stronger each week, and she had learned to trust the instincts that had carried her this far. The board meeting convened at 2 o'clock in the conference room that occupied the northeast corner of the 42nd floor, its windows offering views that extended to horizons most people would never reach. 12 members arranged themselves around a table crafted from oak that had been growing in Connecticut forests while the American Revolution was being planned, their positions reflecting hierarchies and alliances that shifted with each quarterly report. Vivian sat at the head of the table in the chair her father had occupied for 3 decades before his body betrayed him, her posture perfect, her expression controlled, her hands steady despite the caffeine and cortisol, and barely contained exhaustion that circulated through her bloodstream. Preston Hale occupied a seat at the table's midpoint, positioned to observe her face while maintaining the appearance of collegial equality that his actual intentions contradicted. The international contract dominated the agenda, 18 months of negotiation condensed into presentations and projections and risk assessments that quantified the unquantifiable with the confident precision that corporate culture demanded. Vivian walked them through the strategic implications, the competitive advantages, the market positioning that this partnership would enable. Her voice remained steady throughout the presentation, revealing nothing of the doubt that lived beneath her professional surface. The questions began as soon as she finished seemingly reasonable inquiries about timeline and execution that carried undertones audible only to those familiar with the particular frequency of corporate hostility. Preston led the most effective attacks while maintaining the appearance of support, prefacing criticisms with phrases like, "I completely agree with Vivian's vision, but," and "perhaps we should consider whether our current leadership structure is optimally positioned to." The other board members watched these exchanges with the careful attention of predators, assessing which animal in the herd appeared weakest. 90 minutes later, Vivian emerged from the conference room with her mask intact and her confidence in ruins. The board had demanded additional documentation before approving the contract, a delay that served no purpose except to extend the period during which her judgment remained under scrutiny and her position remained vulnerable. She had answered every question correctly and convincingly, and it had not mattered because the questions were not designed to elicit information, but to establish dominance and undermine authority. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked toward the elevator bank, each step a small declaration of the control she no longer fully believed she possessed. The lobby had emptied as afternoon shifted toward evening, junior employees escaping to lives that existed outside these walls, lives with boundaries and balance, and the luxury of forgetting about work when work was finished for the day. Vivian could not remember the last time she had experienced that luxury. On the 38th floor, Grayson Mercer had completed his assigned duties and was preparing to move to the next section of his route when the control panel for Elevator 3 captured his attention with the insistence of a warning that demanded acknowledgement. The display showed codes he recognized immediately, patterns etched into his memory by his father's patient instruction, and reinforced by years of military experience with transportation systems that failed catastrophically when maintenance was neglected or corners were cut. His father had owned a repair shop in Newark for 37 years before retirement claimed him a cramped space filled with machinery that most people considered worthless, but that Thomas Mercer approached with the reverence others reserved for religious artifacts. Grayson had spent his childhood in that shop learning to read the language of mechanical failure, understanding that machines communicated their distress to anyone patient enough to listen and knowledgeable enough to interpret what they heard. The elevator's control panel was screaming. Hydraulic pressure readings fluctuated beyond parameters that any engineer would consider acceptable, oscillating in patterns that suggested systemic failure rather than sensor malfunction. Cable tension indicators showed irregularities consistent with stress fractures developing in the support system, metal fatigue accumulating toward the threshold, where physics would override engineering and gravity would claim whatever cargo the elevator happened to contain. The error codes scrolling across the display matched patterns Grayson had encountered once before during a deployment when a military transport elevator had failed and dropped 2 tons of equipment 40 feet into a concrete pit. No one had been inside that elevator when it fell. The memory of what could have happened still visited him during nightmares that followed him home from wars he had survived. His radio crackled against his hip, the connection compromised by interference from the building's steel skeleton. He pressed the transmit button and spoke with the clarity that emergency communication required, describing the error codes, the pressure fluctuations, the urgent need for immediate inspection by qualified personnel. The voice that responded belonged to someone in the maintenance department whose name Grayson had never learned, someone who sounded irritated at being interrupted during whatever task had occupied their attention before his call disrupted their routine. Probably a sensor glitch, the voice declared with the confidence of someone who had never witnessed mechanical failure translate into human tragedy. We will check it next week. Grayson attempted to explain the severity of what he was observing, but the connection terminated before his words could reach their destination. Next week. The phrase echoed through his mind as he stared at the elevator doors, imagining scenarios that his training made vivid and his experience made plausible. Cables fraying inside the shaft while passengers scrolled through emails oblivious to the catastrophe developing around them. Counterweights straining against metal that had exceeded its tolerance, while executives discussed quarterly projections in language designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The sudden lurch, the stomach-dropping freefall, the impact that would transform living people into statistics that insurance actuaries would process with professional detachment. He could not wait for next week. He could not trust the judgment of people who dismiss safety concerns as inconveniences to be addressed when schedules permitted. His daughter needed him to come home tonight and every night after, and the thought of any child waiting for a parent who would never return because someone decided that elevator maintenance could be postponed made his stomach clench with fury he barely recognized as his own. The executive floor had emptied gradually as afternoons surrendered to evening staff members escaping to happy hours and gym sessions, and the ordinary lives that Vivian Ashford observed from her glass-walled office, like a scientist studying specimens she could document but never join. The elevator bank waited ahead of her, 6 doors offering escape from the building that had become both her greatest achievement and her most elegant prison. She walked toward elevator 3 without conscious thought, her mind still processing the board meeting's implications, cataloging criticisms, and calculating responses, planning strategies for the conflict that would resume tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until she either prevailed completely or was removed entirely. The man who stepped into her path registered initially as an obstacle, a shape in a maintenance uniform that had no legitimate reason to interrupt her trajectory through her own building. His voice reached her before his face fully resolved into individual features. "Ma'am, I need you to use a different elevator. This one is showing mechanical failures." Vivian stopped, her heels clicking into silence on the marble floor, her eyes focusing on the face of the man who had apparently concluded that his janitorial duties included providing instructions to the chief executive officer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with features weathered by experiences that had nothing to do with boardrooms or quarterly reports. His eyes held steady on hers with a directness that most employees learn to avoid within their first week of employment, and something in his posture suggested military training, the particular confidence of someone who had survived situations that made corporate politics seem trivial by comparison. I reported it to maintenance. He continued, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something important to someone who should already understand its significance. But until they inspect it, no one should use this elevator. The words landed on Vivian like accusations, each syllable implying that her judgment required correction from someone whose position in her organization could not possibly qualify him to offer such correction. She felt the weight of every witness in the corridor, felt the attention of employees who would carry this story to their desks and spread it through the company like infection through a vulnerable host. The board had questioned her authority this afternoon. Now a janitor was questioning her authority this evening. The pattern suggested weakness, and weakness in her position attracted the kind of attention that destroyed careers and dismantled empires. "You are a janitor," her voice emerged coated in frost that would have been appropriate for January in Minnesota, the temperature in the corridor seeming to drop as she spoke. "I do not take orders from janitors." The cruelty was deliberate, calculated to establish hierarchy and restore the authority that his intervention had momentarily disrupted. She watched his expression for the flinch, the retreat, the submission that her position demanded and her pride required. Instead, she found only steady patience, the composure of someone who had faced criticism far more dangerous than executive displeasure, and emerged with his sense of self intact. "I am not giving orders." His response carried no defensiveness, no trace of the apologetic deference that usually accompanied challenges to her authority. "I am giving you information that could save your life. The elevator is showing hydraulic failures and cable tension irregularities. I have seen these patterns before in situations that ended badly. Please use a different elevator." His voice remained level, but something in his eyes shifted as he spoke, something that resembled concern rather than confrontation, as if he genuinely believed the danger he described and genuinely wanted to protect her from it. The corridor had fallen silent, every employee within earshot holding their breath, waiting to see how the CEO would respond to this unprecedented challenge from the lowest rung of the corporate ladder. The board meeting replayed in Vivian's memory those polite suggestions that perhaps her judgment was compromised, perhaps her emotions clouded her thinking, perhaps the stress of leadership had exceeded her capacity to manage it. Now this man, this nobody in a gray uniform whose name she would never bother to learn, was standing between her and an elevator in her own building, questioning her ability to navigate her own space safely. The pressure that had been building throughout this terrible day found its release in words that emerged before wisdom could contain them. "Step aside or step into my office to collect your final paycheck." He did not move. His eyes held hers with that same infuriating steadiness, as if her threat carried no more weight than the wind that occasionally rattled windows 42 floors above the street. "Ma'am, please," he began, and the gentleness in his voice somehow made everything worse, made her feel simultaneously furious and ashamed and desperate to end this conversation before the shame could overcome the fury. "You are fired." The words emerged sharp as surgical instruments, designed to cut cleanly and decisively and permanently. "Security will escort you out." She expected argument, pleading the desperate justifications that terminated employees typically offered in their final moments of corporate existence. Instead, he studied her face for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted into territory she could not immediately identify, something that might have been understanding, or might have been disappointment, or might have been the recognition of something she had not intended to reveal. He nodded slowly, the movement carrying resignation rather than defeat, and stepped aside to let her pass. Vivian walked toward elevator 3 without looking back, her chin lifted, her posture perfect, her heart beating faster than she wanted to acknowledge. She pressed the call button and waited, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hesitation, refusing to acknowledge the doubt that his warning had ignited somewhere beneath her carefully maintained defenses. The elevator arrived with a pleasant chime and its doors sliding open to reveal the polished interior that her design team had selected to convey luxury and reliability and the absolute safety that modern engineering was supposed to guarantee. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby, and the doors closed on the man she had just destroyed for the crime of trying to help her. Grayson watched the elevator doors seal shut and felt the particular heaviness that accompanies the knowledge that you have done everything possible and it has not been enough. His toolbox waited where he had left it earlier, filled with supplies he would never use in this building again, and his mind was already calculating the financial implications of unexpected unemployment. The severance would be minimal if it existed at all, certainly insufficient to cover more than a few weeks of rent and groceries. His savings account held enough to survive perhaps 2 months of careful spending, assuming he eliminated every non-essential expense and found new employment within 3 weeks. Willa's school tuition was paid through the semester, a small mercy in what promised to be a difficult stretch. He had survived worse circumstances. He had rebuilt from nothing multiple times. The uniform he wore was just fabric, and the job he had lost was just a bomb, and the woman who had fired him was just another person too, consumed by her own struggles to recognize when someone was trying to help. He turned toward the service elevator that would carry him to the parking garage, where his truck waited with its child seat still strapped in the back and its dashboard cluttered with drawings Willa made during the commutes that had become their morning ritual. He had reached the stairwell door when the building shook with a violence that traveled through concrete and steel and into his bones with the unmistakable signature of catastrophic mechanical failure. The sound arrived a fraction of a second later, not the sharp crack of explosion, but the deep groan of metal surrendering to forces it could no longer resist, the particular frequency of disaster that his training had taught him to recognize instantly. Alarms erupted throughout the corridor, their shrieking designed to trigger evacuation protocols that his body began executing automatically, even as his mind processed the implications of what his body already understood. His radio crackled with voices overlapping in panic, fragmentary reports assembling themselves into a picture he had hoped desperately to avoid. Elevator 3, 42nd floor, smoke visible, someone trapped inside. The words passed through him and became movement, his toolbox abandoned on the floor where it fell, his feet carrying him not toward the exits where everyone else was fleeing, but toward the stairwell where every step upward brought him closer to the disaster he had failed to prevent. The woman in the red dress had ignored his warning and stepped into an elevator he told her was dangerous, and now she was trapped in a smoke-filled cabin somewhere above him, and the only thing that mattered was reaching her before the margins disappeared entirely. The service elevator waited at the end of the corridor, its industrial design intended for cargo rather than passengers, its systems connected to backup power that the passenger elevators did not share. Grayson pressed the call button and calculated the odds while the machinery responded to his summons. The service elevator would take him to the 30th floor before safety protocols automatically disabled it, which meant 12 floors of stairs between him and whatever remained of elevator 3. 12 floors could be climbed in minutes by someone in reasonable physical condition. He had climbed mountains in Afghanistan, carrying combat loads that exceeded his own body weight. He could climb 12 floors in a Manhattan office building where the only enemy was time and smoke and the terrible mathematics of oxygen deprivation. The service elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for 30, and watching the numbers climb as the building's emergency systems continued their electronic screaming. The ascent took 90 seconds that felt like hours, his mind running scenarios and calculating probabilities, and preparing for conditions that his training had covered extensively, but that no training could fully anticipate. The doors opened on the 30th floor, and smoke was already visible, seeping through ventilation shafts and curling along ceiling tiles like something alive and hunting. He took a breath of relatively clean air, held it, and began to run. The stairwell became a tunnel of effort and determination, each floor marked by numbers that counted down toward his destination. 31, 32, 33. His legs burned with the exertion and his lungs demanded air that grew progressively more contaminated with each flight he conquered. A security guard appeared at the 35th floor landing, his hand grabbing Grayson's arm with authority that the circumstances rendered irrelevant. "Sir, you need to evacuate. You are not authorized to be in this building." Grayson did not slow, did not stop, did not waste breath on explanations that the guard would not understand and could not process quickly enough to matter. "Someone is dying up there," he said, the words emerging between gasps that revealed the toll his body was paying for this ascent. The guard's grip loosened his training, struggling to categorize a situation that no procedure manual had anticipated, and Grayson was past him before the decision to release could become a decision to restrain. 38, 39, 40. The smoke thickened with each floor visibility decreasing and the acrid taste of combustion coating his tongue and throat with residue that his body would be processing for weeks. 41. 42. He burst through the stairwell door onto the executive floor and found chaos that exceeded even his most pessimistic expectations. Smoke billowed from the elevator shaft in clouds dense enough to obscure walls and ceiling, black and toxic, and carrying particulates that his lungs attempted to filter and failed. Emergency lighting cast red shadows across surfaces that had been designed for elegance rather than emergency, and through the haze he could see the elevator doors for number 3 sealed shut and radiating the particular finality of systems that had failed catastrophically. The fire axe hung in its cabinet like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Grayson broke the glass with his elbow, feeling the impact register as sensation without pain, his hands closing around the handle with familiarity that transcended the specific tool. The elevator doors were reinforced steel engineered to withstand exactly this kind of assault, designed to contain failures rather than permit rescues that the engineers had apparently considered unnecessary to plan for. He swung anyway, the blade biting into metal with a sound that echoed through the smoke-filled corridor, like a declaration of intent. The doors dented with the first impact, and he swung again, adjusting his angle and increasing his force, attacking the weakness he could sense in the structure. The metal cracked on the 6th swing, a fissure opening along the seam where the doors met, and he dropped the axe and inserted his fingers into the gap and began to pull. Something tore in his shoulder as the doors separated, a sharp, bright pain that his adrenaline immediately suppressed and filed away for later attention. The opening widened with grinding reluctance, metal protesting the violation of its design parameters, and through the gap, he could see the interior of the elevator cabin. Vivian Ashford lay crumpled on the floor in her red dress, blonde hair spread across tiles that had been selected for their visual appeal rather than their suitability for emergency medical procedures. Her eyes were closed, her chest was still. Her lips had taken on the dusky purple that indicated oxygen deprivation reaching critical levels. He forced the doors apart the final inches required for his body to pass through and dropped into the cabin landing beside her and beginning the assessment that his training made automatic. Not breathing. The observation registered with clinical precision even as his hands moved to check her pulse, finding it present but weak and irregular, a heart struggling to function without the oxygen it required. Carbon monoxide poisoning from the smoke. Respiratory arrest from particulate inhalation. Minutes remaining before brain damage became permanent, possibly fewer given the duration of exposure he could not calculate. He hooked his arms under hers and dragged her through the opening he had created, lifting her over the threshold where the doors waited to close again and pulling her into the stairwell, where the smoke was thinner and the air was marginally cleaner and the conditions for emergency resuscitation were marginally less impossible. He laid her flat on the concrete landing and tilted her head back to open her airway, his fingers checking her mouth for obstructions, while his other hand positioned her chin for optimal air passage. Still not breathing, still barely a pulse. The protocol assembled itself in his mind with the clarity of countless repetitions, training that had saved lives in conditions far worse than this knowledge that existed in his muscles and reflexes as much as in his conscious thoughts. 30 compressions at the rate of 100 per minute, 2 breaths delivered with enough force to expand the lungs, but not enough to damage them. Repeat until the heart remembers its purpose, or time declares the effort futile. His hands interlocked over her sternum, heel of his palm finding the correct position through touch rather than sight, and he began the compressions that would manually circulate her blood while her heart recovered from whatever trauma had interrupted its rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He counted in silence, his body performing the mechanics while his mind observed with the detached professionalism that combat had taught him to maintain even in circumstances that defied professional detachment. Her ribs flexed beneath the pressure he applied. Her blood moved through vessels that her heart could not currently power. Her brain received oxygen that her lungs could not currently provide. He reached 30 and shifted position, pinching her nose closed with one hand while tilting her chin with the other, pressing his mouth against lips that were cold and unresponsive, and carrying the taste of smoke and something else he could not identify. He breathed into her, watching her chest rise with air that had moments ago filled his own lungs, and breathed again, before returning to compressions that his arms were beginning to protest. The rhythm consumed him entirely, the world narrowing to the cycle of push and breathe and push and breathe, the count that marked the difference between efforts that succeeded and efforts that simply postponed inevitable outcomes. 40 seconds passed that felt like 40 years. 60 seconds passed that felt like the entire span of human history condensed into the space between one compression and the next. Her lips remained cold against his each time he delivered breath. Her body remained still beneath his hands each time he paused to check for independent signs of life. The words escaped him without permission, a plea to whatever forces governed outcomes he could not control. Come on. Come on. Do not do this. Do not die in a stairwell because you were too proud to listen to someone trying to help you. You have battles left to fight and people depending on you and whatever else matters to you more than being human for 30 seconds. Come on. Breathe. She gasped. The sound was harsh and wet and ragged, a rattling intake that announced her lungs were attempting to function again. Her body was fighting to reclaim the life that had been slipping away. Coughs followed immediately violent spasms that shook her frame and expelled smoke and contaminated air, and the residue of near death that her respiratory system was desperately trying to purge. Her eyes opened unfocused, at first seeing shapes and shadows rather than the specific features of the man kneeling above her. Tears leaked from the corners, involuntary responses to trauma and oxygen deprivation, and the chemical irritation that smoke had inflicted on membranes designed for gentler environments. She tried to speak and produced only more coughing, her voice reduced to rasps that communicated nothing except the fundamental fact of her survival. Easy. Grayson kept his hands on her shoulders, steadying her against the tremors that racked her body, his face close enough that she could see him through the blur of tears and smoke residue. Do not try to talk. You are safe now. He watched her eyes gradually focus, watched recognition arrive in stages, as her oxygen-deprived brain rebuilt its connections to a world it had nearly departed permanently. The confusion came first, then the fear, then something else he could not immediately categorize, something that might have been gratitude, or might have been shame, or might have been the simple, overwhelming relief of someone who had expected to die and discovered that expectation unfulfilled. You. Her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, the words scraping against vocal cords that smoke had damaged and trauma had weakened. You came back. Of course I did. The words carried no accusation, no reminder of how she had treated him, no suggestion that his presence required explanation or justification. He helped her into a sitting position, his hands supporting her back as she struggled to orient herself in space that remained unfamiliar despite the countless times she had walked through this building, believing herself safe. The stairwell door burst open and paramedics flooded the landing with equipment and expertise and the particular urgency that emergency medical professionals brought to scenes where seconds continued to matter. Grayson stepped back, making room for people whose training was more recent and whose equipment was more sophisticated, watching as oxygen masks and monitoring devices and the machinery of professional intervention surrounded the woman he had pulled from the elevator. Vivian felt hands lifting her onto a stretcher, felt straps securing her against movement. Her body was too weak to attempt anyway, felt the disconnection from reality that trauma induces when the nervous system decides that processing current events exceeds available bandwidth. She tried to find Grayson in the crowd of uniforms and equipment, tried to locate the face of the man who had breathed his life into her lungs when her own breathing had failed. But the world was tilting and blurring, and the darkness was returning with the gentle insistence of something that could not be resisted. The last thing she saw before consciousness retreated entirely was his eyes still watching her from behind the paramedics, still carrying that steady patience she had mistaken for insubordination and was beginning to recognize as something far more valuable. In an office 40 floors above the chaos, Preston Hale stood at his window and watched emergency vehicles accumulate in the street below with lights that painted the evening in shades of crisis. His phone displayed messages confirming what his eyes were already telling him: the plan had failed. Vivian Ashford had survived an incident that should have been impossible to survive, rescued by someone whose presence in that stairwell defied every probability Preston had calculated. He pulled up the personnel files on his computer and found the name attached to the face he had observed on security footage during the rescue: a janitor named Grayson Mercer, whose employment record indicated nothing that explained how he had known to check the elevator, how he had reached the 42nd floor before emergency responders, how he had performed resuscitation techniques that most civilians could not execute under optimal conditions. The messages from his associates reported that Mercer had noticed error codes on the elevator control panel before the failure occurred, had attempted to warn maintenance, had tried to prevent Vivian from entering the elevator. She ultimately entered anyway. The janitor had seen something that should have been invisible, had understood something that should have been incomprehensible, had interfered with plans that had required months of careful preparation. If Mercer understood what he had seen, if he recognized the patterns that distinguish sabotage from accident, if he mentioned his observations to anyone with the authority to investigate the consequences, would extend far beyond failed plans and lost opportunities. Preston studied the photograph in the personnel file, memorizing features he might need to recognize in circumstances he was already beginning to plan. The janitor had a daughter, according to the records, 7 years old, attended Lincoln Elementary. That information would be useful if persuasion proved necessary. The ambulance carrying Vivian Ashford departed with sirens announcing urgency that the traffic below was already accommodating. Preston watched it disappear into the Manhattan evening and began composing the messages that would set his contingency plans into motion. The janitor had become a variable that required management. The CEO had survived, but would be weakened and distracted by recovery. The international contract remained unsigned and vulnerable to the delays that board members could be convinced to impose. The situation was salvageable, he decided, if he moved quickly enough and ruthlessly enough, and without the hesitation that had characterized his previous approach. Vivian Ashford had been given a second chance at life. Preston Hale intended to ensure she did not receive a third. The hospital room materialized around Vivian Ashford in fragments that assembled themselves with the reluctant cooperation of a consciousness that had nearly departed permanently. First came the antiseptic smell that announced medical environments, before vision could confirm their details, that particular combination of disinfectant and filtered air that signified institutional care in the proximity of crisis. Then came the steady electronic beeping of monitors tracking vital signs that someone had determined were important enough to measure continuously, numbers and graphs, translating her survival into data that could be documented and analyzed and billed to insurance companies. Finally came the texture of sheets that had been laundered so many times they felt less like fabric than like resignation woven into thread. Count the particular softness of materials designed for efficiency rather than comfort. She opened her eyes to white walls and fluorescent lighting that seemed unnecessarily aggressive for a room presumably dedicated to healing, and to the face of Margot Sullivan, who occupied a chair beside the bed with the exhausted vigilance of someone who had been waiting too long or the sign that their vigil would conclude well. Her assistant's laptop rested on her knees in the position it always occupied when work could not be completely abandoned, but her hands were still, and her eyes were fixed on Vivian's face with an intensity that the professional distance between them had never previously permitted. The laptop screen displayed emails that Margot had apparently stopped reading when consciousness began stirring in the woman she served. "You are awake." Margot's voice carried fractures that her professional demeanor could not entirely conceal the sound of relief that had been contained too long, finally finding release. "Thank God, Vivian, you stopped breathing. You were minutes from permanent damage when he found you." The pronouns registered before the details did the he, requiring identification and context that Vivian's oxygen-deprived brain was still struggling to reconstruct from memories that felt more like dreams than events she had actually experienced. Her throat felt like she had swallowed gravel, mixed with broken glass, each word requiring effort that exceeded her current reserves. What happened? The question emerged as a rasp that barely qualified as speech, her vocal cords protesting the demands being placed upon them after the trauma they had endured. Margot set the laptop aside with the careful movements of someone handling objects that might shatter, her expression shifting through variations of concern that Vivian had never seen directed at her from an employee who had always maintained appropriate boundaries. Elevator 3 failed. Margot's explanation arrived in measured portions, as if delivering too much information too quickly might overwhelm systems still recovering from catastrophic disruption. Carbon monoxide accumulated in the shaft. You lost consciousness before the emergency stop triggered. You were not breathing when Grayson Mercer reached you. Vivian touched her lips with fingers that trembled despite her efforts to control them, finding the tissue tender and slightly swollen, carrying sensations she could not immediately explain through any mechanism she remembered experiencing. He gave me CPR. The statement emerged as question and confirmation, simultaneously her mind assembling fragments into a narrative that her body had experienced but her consciousness had not fully witnessed. She remembered pressure on her chest, rhythmic and insistent. She remembered something warm against her mouth there, being forced into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe independently. She remembered darkness retreating, replaced by a face above her that she had recognized with delayed comprehension as belonging to the man she had fired mere minutes before the disaster she had walked into. Margot nodded, her expression carrying weight that transcended the simple confirmation of medical facts. For nearly 2 minutes until paramedics arrived. He pried the elevator doors apart with his bare hands after using a fire axe to crack them open. He carried you into the stairwell and kept you alive through sheer determination when anyone else would have assumed you were already gone. The words painted a picture that contradicted everything Vivian believed she understood about hierarchy and value and the relationship between job titles and human worth. The janitor she had dismissed as incapable of judgment worth considering had demonstrated judgment and capability that her highest-paid executives could not have matched. I fired him. Vivian heard herself speak the words without consciously deciding to voice them, the admission emerging from somewhere deeper than her usual carefully filtered communications. Her throat burned with the effort, but the pain seemed appropriate given the magnitude of what she was acknowledging. Yes, you did. Margot's response carried an edge that Vivian had never heard from her assistant, a departure from the professional deference that had characterized their relationship for 6 years. And he came back anyway. He ran up 12 flights of stairs, through smoke that was already filling the stairwell. He broke through doors designed to resist exactly that kind of assault. He breathed his own air into your lungs when your lungs had stopped breathing on their own. Margot paused, her eyes holding Vivian's with an intensity that felt like accusation. He saved your life, and you never even thanked him. The words landed with the force of physical blows, each observation adding weight to a shame that Vivian had not permitted herself to feel in years. She had constructed her identity around the certainty that her judgment was reliable, that her instincts were trustworthy, that the authority she had fought so hard to acquire granted her the right to exercise it without question or consequence. Now she lay in a hospital bed, breathing through lungs that a janitor had manually kept functioning, forced to acknowledge that the walls she had built to protect her strength had instead revealed her weakness to anyone paying sufficient attention. Where is he now? The question emerged before she could decide whether asking it was wise, her need for information overwhelming the caution that usually governed her communications. Margot's expression softened slightly, the disappointment giving way to something that might have been hope or might have been recognition that shame was the first step toward change that circumstances now demanded. He left. Margot's voice carried the weight of information she had already researched and cataloged, the details organized in the mental files she maintained on everything relevant to her employer's life. He gave his statement to the fire investigators and refused any compensation or media attention. When reporters tried to interview him, he walked past them without acknowledging their existence. When the company offered money, he declined it. He went home to his daughter without asking for anything in return for what he had done. The final detail struck Vivian with particular force, the reminder that this man she had treated as disposable had a life beyond the uniform. She had focused on exclusively responsibilities and relationships that existed independent of his function in her building. Find his address. The instruction emerged quietly but carried the firmness that had directed board meetings and negotiated contracts and rebuilt the company her father had believed would collapse under her leadership. I need to talk to him. Margot reached for her phone with the efficiency that had made her indispensable for 6 years, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced precision. I already have it. She looked up with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for this request, perhaps hoping for it. I thought you might want it eventually. 3 days later, Vivian stood on a Brooklyn sidewalk in a neighborhood where Ashford Industries executives never ventured unless their navigation systems had malfunctioned catastrophically. She had dressed down for the occasion, trading the power wardrobe that announced her status for jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than most people in this area earned in a week, but that at least did not immediately identify her as someone from a different economic universe. Her driver had wanted to accompany her into the building, citing security concerns and the unfamiliarity of the environment, but she had refused with an insistence that surprised them both. This apology required her to be vulnerable in ways that bodyguards and assistants would not permit, exposed in ways that her usual armor would prevent. The stairwell smelled like cooking spices mixed with industrial cleaner, a combination that should have been unpleasant but instead triggered memories she had spent decades trying to bury beneath the wealth that had eventually accumulated around her. Her family's fortune had not always been certain. Her father's business had nearly collapsed twice during her childhood, and she remembered meals stretched thin and vacations canceled, and the particular fear that lived in her mother's eyes when bills arrived that they could not immediately pay. She had sworn to never feel that vulnerability again, had built her empire specifically to insulate herself from the economic uncertainty that had terrorized her childhood. Now she climbed stairs in a building where that vulnerability was simply the baseline condition, the starting point from which residents negotiated their daily survival. Door 17 waited at the end of a corridor lit by bulbs that needed replacement and decorated with welcome mats that suggested the people behind these doors still believed in hospitality, despite everything their circumstances might justify feeling otherwise. Vivian knocked and waited, her heart beating faster than any board meeting had ever accelerated it, her hands trembling slightly in a way she could not remember experiencing since childhood confrontations with her father's disappointment. The girl who answered had blonde hair pulled into pigtails that were slightly uneven, as if the person who had created them was still learning the technique. Her blue eyes examined Vivian with the frank curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to conceal reactions behind social masks that adults considered essential. She wore overalls covered in colorful patches that appeared to be hand-sewn rather than manufactured, and she held a screwdriver in one hand and what appeared to be the disassembled components of an old radio in the other. The combination was unexpected and charming evidence of a childhood being spent building things rather than simply acquiring them. "Hello." The girl's voice carried politeness that had clearly been taught, but also a directness that seemed entirely her own creation. "Are you lost?" The question was reasonable given the obvious disparity between Vivian's appearance and the building's typical residents, the assumption that someone who looked like her must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Vivian found herself smiling, a genuine expression that surprised her with its authenticity after so many days of performing emotions she did not actually feel. "I am looking for Grayson Mercer. Is your dad home?" The girl turned and called into the apartment with volume that suggested she was accustomed to being heard across distances larger than the small space her voice was currently traversing. "Daddy, there is a pretty lady here." The announcement carried neither suspicion nor excessive enthusiasm, simply the factual reporting of information that seemed relevant to the household's operations. Footsteps approached, and then Grayson Mercer stood in the doorway, his presence filling the frame with the solid reliability that Vivian was beginning to associate with everything about him. He wore jeans and an old Army t-shirt whose logo had faded to the point where the specific branch of service it represented was no longer clearly identifiable, and his eyes held the same steady patience that she remembered from the lobby and the stairwell, and the moment when consciousness had returned to show her his face above her own. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence communicating acknowledgments and recognitions that words might have complicated or diminished. "Miss Ashford." His voice was careful but not cold neutral, without being unwelcoming, the tone of someone who had not yet determined how this unexpected encounter should be categorized and processed. "Vivian, please." She swallowed against the tightness in her throat, the emotion she had spent years suppressing threatening to surface at the worst possible moment. "Can I come in?" He hesitated, something flickering across his features that might have been caution or curiosity or the recognition that refusing her request would require explanations he was not prepared to provide. Then he stepped aside to let her enter the movement, carrying neither enthusiasm nor reluctance, but simply the practical accommodation of a situation that had arrived without his permission. The apartment was smaller than her penthouse closet, but maintained with a precision that suggested military habits applied to civilian circumstances. Toys were organized in bins labeled with handwritten tags indicating their contents. Dishes dried in a rack beside a sink that showed no evidence of neglected maintenance. Framed photographs covered available surfaces. Images of a beautiful dark-haired woman smiling from moments that had been captured before tragedy erased her from the household she had obviously loved. Vivian felt like an intruder in something sacred, a visitor who had not earned the right to witness the intimate details of grief that this space contained. Willa watched her with the undisguised fascination of a child encountering something novel enough to warrant sustained attention. "Are you the Ice Queen from Daddy's work?" The question emerged with perfect innocence, apparently repeating terminology she had overheard without understanding its implications. Grayson's face flushed with embarrassment that he attempted unsuccessfully to conceal. "Willa." The single word carried mild reproof, mixed with the particular helplessness of a parent whose child has repeated something not intended for external audiences. Vivian laughed, and the sound surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise the others in the room. The laugh was genuine rather than performed, emerging from somewhere beneath the professional exterior that she had worn for so long, she had nearly forgotten it was a costume rather than her actual self. "I suppose I am, or I was." She lowered herself until her eyes were level with the girls, a position that felt simultaneously awkward and appropriate for the message she needed to deliver. "I came to apologize to your father. He tried to help me, and I was very rude to him." Willa considered this information with the seriousness that children sometimes apply to matters adults consider trivial and trivialize matters that actually deserve attention. "Daddy says even when people are mean, we should still help them if they need it, because everyone is fighting something we cannot see." The words carried the cadence of a lesson that had been repeated frequently enough to become memorized philosophy transmitted from parent to child in the ordinary moments of daily life. Vivian felt her throat tighten with emotion she could not entirely identify or control. She looked up at Grayson, who was watching this exchange with an expression that combined surprise and something that might have been pride. "You are raising an incredible person." "I am trying." The response carried humility that seemed genuine rather than performed acknowledgement of effort rather than claim of achievement. He guided Willa toward her room with the gentle steering that parents develop through countless repetitions of similar redirections. "Sweetheart, can you give us a few minutes?" Willa departed with visible reluctance, glancing back at Vivian like she was a puzzle that required additional observation before it could be solved. The door to her room closed with a soft click of obedience that would not necessarily persist, and Vivian found herself alone with the man whose existence had complicated everything she believed about the world and her place within it. She straightened from her crouch and faced him directly, drawing on reserves of courage that felt less adequate than the situations that had previously demanded them. "I came to apologize and to offer you your job back with a significant raise and whatever title seems appropriate for someone with your capabilities. I do not want it." The words were gentle but carried finality that did not invite negotiation, the tone of someone who had considered his position carefully and reached conclusions that would not be revised by increased compensation or improved working conditions. Vivian blinked her mind, struggling to process a response that contradicted every assumption she had made about how this conversation would proceed. "I do not understand." Grayson met her eyes with the same direct gaze that she remembered from the lobby when she had mistaken his confidence for insubordination and his competence for presumption. "I do not want to work for someone who values me because I saved their life. I want to work for someone who values me because I am good at what I do." He paused, letting the distinction register before continuing. "You did not fire me because I was bad at my job. You fired me because I made you look weak in front of people whose opinions mattered to you. That is not a work environment I want to return to." The truth of his assessment struck her with force that exceeded physical impact, each word in illuminating aspects of herself she had preferred to leave in darkness. He had diagnosed her accurately and completely, identified the pathology that governed her behavior, without the protective language that she would have used to disguise it from herself. She had fired him because his help embarrassed her, because his competence highlighted her limitations, because his intervention revealed vulnerabilities she had spent years learning to conceal. "You are right." The admission emerged without the defensiveness that usually accompanied her acknowledgement of error, simply the recognition of truth that could not be denied. "I was wrong. I was—" She struggled for honesty that felt unfamiliar in her mouth, like speaking a language she had learned in childhood but had not used for decades. "I was scared. The board is trying to push me out. I am losing control of my own company. And when you stopped me in front of everyone, all I could think about was how it looked. How weak I looked. Accepting help is not weakness. His voice carried no judgment, only observation offered from the perspective of someone who had learned this lesson through experiences that made corporate politics seem trivial by comparison. I know that now. Vivian's gaze traveled to the photographs on the wall, images of the woman whose absence filled this apartment with grief that time had not fully processed. You lost someone. 3 years ago. Car accident. The words were simple but carried weight that suggested depths of pain that simplicity could not adequately convey. Grayson's expression shifted into something more vulnerable than she had seen from him previously, the particular openness that grief demands of those who experience it fully rather than suppressing it beneath professional masks. I am sorry. The condolence felt inadequate, but was all she could offer given the circumstances. Thank you. He was quiet for a moment as if considering how much to share with someone who had so recently been an enemy, but was now occupying territory that felt less clearly defined. After Elise died, I had to learn to accept help in ways I had never permitted myself before. From neighbors who brought meals without being asked. From teachers who gave Willa extra attention when she was struggling. From strangers who held doors when I was carrying groceries and a sleeping child and did not have enough hands for everything that needed to be carried. Vivian listened with attention she rarely gave to anyone who was not negotiating something she wanted her usual defenses suspended by circumstances that had rendered them irrelevant. I learned that people offering help are not trying to prove that you are weak. His eyes held hers with intensity that felt like light illuminating spaces she had kept dark for years. They are trying to prove that you are not alone. Something cracked inside Vivian, some wall she had been constructing since her father's death, and reinforcing with every professional victory that followed. The ice she had accumulated as protection against the vulnerabilities that warmth invited began to fracture along the lines she could not predict or control. I do not know how to not be alone. The confession emerged before she could stop it, honest in a way that she had not been with anyone in years. It is a practice. His response carried neither pity nor a prescription, simply the observation of someone who had traveled similar terrain and emerged with knowledge that could be shared. You get better at it, she smiled sadly, feeling the truth of his statement without yet knowing how to apply it to circumstances that still seemed impossible to navigate differently. I should go. I am sorry for taking your time. As she reached for the door, Willa's voice called from the bedroom with volume that suggested she had been listening despite instructions to the contrary. Will you come back? I like you. The question carried the simplicity that children apply to matters adults complicate, unnecessarily the straightforward expression of preference that social training eventually teaches most people to conceal. Vivian looked at Grayson, uncertain whether the invitation implicit in his daughter's question was one he would endorse or resent. He shrugged slightly, a gesture that managed to convey permission without commitment. Door is always open. She left carrying those words like a gift she was not sure she deserved, climbing downstairs that smelled less foreign than they had when she ascended them an hour ago. Her driver waited beside the car with the patient professionalism that obscured whatever opinions he held about the neighborhood or its inhabitants, opening her door and closing it behind her without comment. The drive back to Manhattan passed in silence that felt less oppressive than contemplative, her mind processing experiences that had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of herself and the world she inhabited. In a van parked across the street from Grayson Mercer's apartment building, 3 men observed Vivian's departure with the focused attention of professionals conducting surveillance they had been well compensated to perform. The one in the driver's seat captured photographs that would be transmitted to clients who had expressed interest in the activities of both parties, now documented on his memory card. The woman who had just emerged from the building matched the photographs they had been provided by their employer, confirming that the relationship between the CEO and the janitor had progressed beyond the professional parameters that had initially defined it. The call connected on the second ring, Preston Hale's voice carrying impatience that expensive cologne and tailored suits could not completely disguise. The woman just left. She was inside for approximately 45 minutes. The surveillance operative reported facts without interpretation, leaving conclusions for the client who was paying for information rather than analysis. Why would Vivian Ashford spend 45 minutes in a janitor's apartment? The question was rhetorical. Preston's voice carrying the frustrated calculation of someone whose plans had been complicated by variables he had not anticipated. Unknown, but she was not accompanied by security and she appeared distressed when she departed. The operative provided observations without speculation, his training having taught him that clients rarely appreciated theories that contradicted their preferences. Preston ended the call without acknowledgement and stared at the ceiling of his office with the particular intensity of someone restructuring strategies that circumstances had rendered insufficient. Vivian was developing connections to the janitor that extended beyond gratitude for rescue services rendered. If she trusted Mercer, if she began consulting him about the elevator failure that his expertise had nearly prevented the investigation that followed, might trace the malfunction to modifications that Preston had carefully arranged to appear accidental. The janitor had become dangerous in ways that extended beyond his inconvenient heroism, and dangerous variables required management that Preston was prepared to provide. The men he contacted for the next phase of his plan were not the same operatives conducting surveillance. These were specialists in persuasion that physical intimidation could provide, professionals who understood that messages delivered with sufficient force rarely required repetition. Their instructions were simple approach. Mercer explained that his involvement in matters concerning Ashford Industries should cease immediately and ensure that he understood the consequences of ignoring this guidance. The mention of his daughter was optional but effective. Preston had learned from previous situations where leverage needed to be applied quickly and convincingly. Parents rarely required extensive persuasion once their children became topics of conversation. 1 week after her visit to Grayson's apartment, Vivian sat in her penthouse contemplating the document that her legal team had prepared regarding the elevator failure. The preliminary investigation suggested mechanical malfunction, consistent with inadequate maintenance conclusions that satisfied insurance requirements, but failed to explain how a building equipped with redundant safety systems could experience the kind of catastrophic failure that had nearly killed her. She had requested deeper analysis, commissioned engineering reviews that exceeded standard protocols, and the results had begun arriving with disturbing consistency. The systems had been modified, one expert concluded. The failures were sequential rather than simultaneous, another observed. Someone had introduced vulnerabilities that normal maintenance would not have detected, a third assessment determined. Her phone displayed a text from a number she had begun to recognize over the past week, conversations that had started with her apology and continued through exchanges that gradually shifted from formal to familiar. Grayson had begun responding to her messages with observations about his daughter's projects, photographs of circuit boards that Willa had assembled from salvaged components, questions about business concepts that a 7-year-old had demanded explanations for after encountering terms in conversations she had overheard. The exchanges felt less like communication than like discovery, each message revealing aspects of a person she had initially reduced to a uniform and a function. The notification that interrupted her reading carried urgency that the previous messages had lacked, Grayson's words arriving in fragments that suggested typing under duress. Being followed. 3 men. Willa with me, near the apartment. Vivian's response was immediate and instinctive. Her security team contacted before conscious decision-making could process the implications of what she was authorizing. Track this number, send everyone available. Now. The location data arrived within minutes, placing Grayson and his daughter on a Brooklyn sidewalk 3 blocks from their apartment stationary in ways that suggested they had been intercepted rather than simply stopped. Vivian was in her car before her driver could complete the standard safety checks, demanding speed that violated traffic laws and professional protocols with equal disregard. The 15-minute drive compressed into 8 through aggressive navigation that her driver executed with skills suggesting previous careers that his resume had not disclosed. She saw them from a block away, Grayson standing with Willa pressed behind him, 3 men arranged in formation that blocked forward and backward movement along the narrow sidewalk. The car had barely stopped before she was opening the door. Her phone already connected to emergency services, her voice announcing their location and the nature of the threat, with clarity that training for corporate presentations had unexpectedly prepared her to deliver. The men were focused on Grayson, unaware of her approach, until she was close enough to shout that police were responding and would arrive within minutes. The tableau froze for a moment that felt elastic, stretched by adrenaline into duration that exceeded objective measurement. Grayson had positioned himself between his daughter and the threat, his body language carrying readiness that revealed training most janitors did not possess. The men facing him held the particular confidence of professionals accustomed to encounters that ended favorably for their side. Their surprise at Vivian's arrival competing with the calculation about how her presence changed the odds they had been expecting. We just want to talk. Want. The speaker was the largest of the three, a man whose face bore scarring that suggested previous conversations that had not remained verbal. Your friend here needs to understand that some matters are not his concern, that interfering in business beyond his understanding has consequences he should consider carefully. Grayson's voice remained level despite circumstances that justified any elevation of tone or volume. I do not know what business you are referring to. I am a janitor. I mop floors and empty trash cans. Whatever you think I have seen or understood, you are mistaken. The man stepped closer, his bulk intended to intimidate through physical presence that Grayson's posture suggested was not producing the desired effect. We are not mistaken, and mistakes have costs. He glanced toward Willa, who was clinging to her father's legs with the silent intensity of a child who understood danger without comprehending its specific nature. Pretty daughter you have there. Would be unfortunate if her father was not available to pick her up from school tomorrow. The threat achieved its intended effect, but not in the manner its deliverer had anticipated. Something shifted in Grayson's expression, a transformation from wary patience to something colder and more focused. The men facing him did not recognize what they were seeing, but Vivian had spent enough time studying competitors across negotiating tables to identify the particular stillness that preceded decisive action. You threaten my daughter. Grayson's voice carried no heat, but the absence of emotion somehow made the words more dangerous rather than less. This conversation ends very differently than you expected. The largest man smirked with confidence that subsequent events would immediately contradict. Big words for someone who cleans toilets for a living. They moved simultaneously, three professionals attacking with coordination that suggested previous experience working together. They expected the encounter to be brief and conclusive, a janitor overwhelmed by numbers and training he could not possibly possess. What they encountered instead was 12 years of military combat instruction applied with an efficiency that left no margin for the recovery their confidence had not anticipated requiring. Grayson caught the first punch and redirected its momentum, using the attacker's own force to propel him into his nearest colleague. The second man's stumbled balance compromised by the unexpected collision, and Grayson's follow-up strike ensured that regaining stability would not be immediately possible. The third attacker produced a knife escalation that the situation's apparent simplicity had not seemed to warrant and found his wrist captured and twisted in a grip that transferred control of the weapon without the resistance that muscle memory had expected to encounter. The entire sequence occupied perhaps 15 seconds duration that transformed the encounter from assault into demonstration of capabilities that uniforms and job titles had obscured. Three men who had expected to deliver a message found themselves delivering instead a confirmation of exactly why their employers should have investigated their target more thoroughly before dispatching intimidation teams. Vivian reached them as the final attacker fell, her approach marked by the emergency sirens now audible in the distance. Grayson stood among men he had neutralized without inflicting damage that would require hospitalization. His breathing elevated but controlled his attention, immediately returning to the child still clutching his legs with grip strength that suggested she would not be easily detached. He looked at Vivian and something passed between them that exceeded the communication that words could have provided. Gratitude mixed with questions about how she had arrived so quickly. Relief competing with recognition that the attack implied threats extending beyond this single encounter. The beginning of understanding that whatever was happening involved both of them in ways that neither had yet fully comprehended. You are coming with me. Vivian's voice carried authority that the situation seemed to demand decision-making that circumstances had simplified into imperatives. Both of you, right now. The drive to Manhattan passed in silence, punctuated only by Willa's quiet breathing, the child having fallen asleep against her father, with the absolute exhaustion that overwhelming emotion produces in the young. Grayson held her with arms that showed no trembling, despite the exertion they had recently performed. His eyes meeting Vivian's across the interior of the car that carried them toward destinations neither had planned to share. Her penthouse occupied territory that existed in different relation to the city then the apartment they had departed, height and glass, and the particular silence that expensive construction could provide. Vivian led them through security systems that recognized her biometrics and admitted them to spaces where Willa's eyes widened despite her exhaustion, the child responding to luxury that exceeded her framework for understanding residential possibilities. Grayson watched his daughter explore the living room with the tentative curiosity of someone encountering an environment that violated every assumption about how people actually lived. He felt the familiar inadequacy, returning the recognition that he did not belong in spaces like this, that his presence represented intrusion rather than invitation, regardless of what words had preceded their arrival. Stop! Vivienne's voice interrupted his spiral before it could fully develop her attention, clearly fixed on expressions she had learned to read over the past week of unexpected communication. Stop thinking you do not deserve safety. I can take care of my daughter. The response carried defensiveness that circumstances had rendered somewhat absurd, but that pride required him to articulate nonetheless. I know you can. She moved to stand beside him, both of them watching Willa discover windows that offered views most people experienced it only through photographs. You are one of the most capable people I have ever encountered, but that attack was because of me, because you saved me, because someone has decided that your involvement in my survival represents a problem requiring solution. So now I am going to make sure you are safe. Please let me. The week that followed transformed the penthouse from residence into something more closely resembling home than either adult had expected. Willa adopted Vivian with the wholehearted enthusiasm that children sometimes offer to people who have not learned to anticipate such gifts, following her through rooms that contained more space than the girl had previously encountered in any single structure, asking questions about business and buildings and what it felt like to be in charge of things that affected thousands of people simultaneously. Why do you not have kids? The question arrived during an evening that had included pizza ordered, because Vivian genuinely did not know how to cook, and board games that Willa had somehow convinced her father to bring from the apartment. The child sprawled across furniture that cost more than most automobiles, displaying comfort and luxury that her upbringing had not prepared, but that her personality seemed to find entirely natural. Vivian considered the question with seriousness it deserved, resisting the impulse to offer deflection that would satisfy social requirements without providing actual information. I never had time. I was always working, always trying to prove something to people who are not alive anymore to see whether I succeeded. That is sad. Willa's assessment carried the directness that children apply before learning that certain observations are better left unexpressed. Kids are great. Vivian laughed, and the sound felt less foreign than it had a week ago. You make a compelling argument. Grayson watched these exchanges from positions that allowed observation without interruption. His heart performing operations he could not name, but that produced sensations he had not experienced since before Elise died. Vivian's walls were coming down with speed that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. The ice queen of professional reputation melting into someone warmer and more uncertain and more human than her public persona had ever suggested. She laughed more frequently and smiled without apparent calculation and permitted Willa to climb into her lap during movies without the stiffness that physical intimacy with strangers usually provoked. She asked him about his military service, listening with attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite performance. She did not flinch when he talked about losing Elise, did not offer platitudes that would have required response he was not prepared to provide. She inhabited his grief without trying to fix or minimize its presence, rather than intervention, the kind of witness that loss required and rarely received from people who had not experienced similar devastation. He found himself noticing things about her that had not registered during their earlier encounters, details that proximity and time gradually revealed. The way she tucked hair behind her ear when concentration demanded temporary adjustment of obstacles to vision. The three expressions she cycled through during work calls: determination when strategies were forming, frustration when obstacles materialized, satisfaction when solutions revealed themselves. The care she directed toward employees during the conversations he overheard concerned that her professional manner concealed but could not completely suppress. One evening after Willa had surrendered to sleep in the guest room that had become hers, they sat on the balcony with wine that Vivian admitted she rarely consumed, and views that even familiarity could not completely diminish. The city spread below them like circuitry, illuminated by electrons flowing through pathways that human intention had designed but could not fully control. Can I ask you something? Vivian's voice carried the particular quality that personal questions acquire when their askers are uncertain whether asking is wise. Grayson nodded, the movement barely visible in the ambient light that Manhattan provided even at hours when other cities achieved something approaching darkness. When you were giving me CPR, what were you thinking? He was silent for long enough that she might have concluded he was choosing not to answer, his attention, apparently fixed on buildings that contain lives being lived without awareness of observation. Finally, his voice reached her through the space between them, carrying weight that suggested the question had accessed memories not frequently revisited. I was thinking that I had already lost one person I cared about, that I would not lose another. Not if anything I could do might prevent it. You did not even know me. The observation contained challenge and wonder in proportions that shifted depending on interpretation. I knew enough. His eyes found hers, holding them with intensity that felt like contact despite the physical distance between their chairs. I knew you were exhausted and scared and trying to hold everything together alone. I knew you reminded me of soldiers I served with, the ones who thought asking for help meant admitting failure they could not forgive themselves for. He paused, letting the words settle before delivering the final portion. I knew you deserved to live. Vivian felt emotion building behind her eyes, years of suppression, suddenly inadequate to the feelings that this conversation had accessed. I remember it, the not breathing, your mouth on mine, feeling like I was drowning and then suddenly being able to breathe again. She touched her lips without conscious decision, the gesture accessing physical memory that consciousness had not fully processed. I have never felt anything like that. Connected to someone at the most fundamental level. You literally kept me alive. Grayson reached across the space between them and took her hand, her fingers cold in the evening air, despite the thermal efficiency of the penthouse. He wrapped them in warmth that his circulation provided, the gesture intimate without being invasive. Thank you, her voice had diminished to whisper that the wind might have claimed if he had not been listening with complete attention, for not giving up on me. Never. The single word carried promise that exceeded its brevity, commitment offered without the conditions that adults usually attach to such declarations. They sat in silence that required no filling hands connected as the city continued its perpetual operations below them. Neither noticed the camera on the adjacent building, its lens adjusted to capture images that would reach Preston Hale before morning arrived to demand that the night surrender the secrets it had accumulated. 3 days before the international contract signing that would determine the trajectory of Ashford Industries for the next decade, Margot Sullivan arrived at the penthouse with a laptop that contained information she had been accumulating for months and conclusions she had finally become confident enough to share. Her expression carried weight that Vivian recognized from crisis situations, the particular tension that preceded revelations requiring immediate response. We need to talk. Margot's voice addressed both occupants of the room, her gaze including Grayson in ways that previous communications had not. This involves both of you, and it cannot wait. The laptop opened to reveal emails organized chronologically, documents assembled into patterns that told a story neither Vivian nor Grayson had possessed complete information to reconstruct. Preston Hale's name appeared repeatedly, his communications with maintenance departments revealing instructions that contradicted standard protocols. Do not inspect elevator 3, one message commanded. The matter has been handled. Margot walked them through the timeline she had assembled, each piece of evidence building toward conclusions that transformed accident into something far more deliberate. The elevator failure had not been mechanical malfunction. It had been sabotage designed to remove Vivian from the leadership position that Preston had believed should have been his. The attack on Grayson had been damage control, an attempt to silence the one person who had recognized signs of tampering before the sabotage achieved its intended purpose. The investigation into Ashford Industries would eventually uncover financial irregularities that explained Preston's desperation. Gambling debts exceeding $3 million owed to organizations that resolved collection disputes through methods that courts did not sanction. The international contract that Vivian was preparing to sign would increase the company's value beyond Preston's ability to acquire it through the hostile takeover he had been positioning himself to execute. He had needed her gone before that contract could be finalized. Why did you wait so long to tell me? Vivian's question contained less accusation than genuine confusion recognition that the evidence Margot had assembled could have been shared at earlier stages. I did not have proof, just suspicion. Margot's eyes held the weight of decisions that had been more difficult than this moment's clarity suggested. And I needed to know I could trust both of you with what I was discovering. Both of us, Grayson's question indicated the surprise that being included in such trust had provoked. The attack proved it. Margot closed the laptop with the finality of arguments that had been concluded. Preston ordered that attack. He is afraid of what you saw, what you might figure out, what you might tell someone who could act on the information. She looked at him directly. You noticed the elevator problems before the failure. That makes you a witness to sabotage, and that makes you dangerous to him. The silence that followed contained calculation and resolve in proportions that would determine subsequent actions. Vivian looked at Grayson, finding in his expression the same recognition that she felt forming in her own thoughts. They were both targets now connected by circumstances that had evolved far beyond the encounter that had initiated their involvement. The contract signing is in 3 days. Vivian's voice carried the particular tone that planning required emotions suppressed in favor of operational clarity. If Preston intends to stop it, that will be his last opportunity. He will target the server room. Grayson's observation drew on military experience with infrastructure attacks. All the evidence is there. Destroy that, and the investigation Margot has been building loses its foundation. Then we protect the server room. Vivian's response contained decision rather than deliberation, and we let him come to us. The plan they developed over the following hours would eventually be recognized as the moment when hunter became hunted, when predator discovered that prey had transformed into something far more dangerous than appearance had suggested. Preston Hale did not know that his carefully constructed scheme had been detected. He did not know that the people he had targeted were now targeting him. He did not know that his next move would be his last. But he would learn. The morning of the contract signing arrived with the kind of October clarity that Manhattan occasionally produces when atmospheric conditions align to transform the city into something resembling the version of itself that appears in photographs tourists carry home as proof of experiences they barely had time to process. Vivian Ashford woke before her alarm could intrude upon consciousness, her mind already calculating the variables that would determine whether this day concluded with triumph or catastrophe. The penthouse was quiet around her, the particular silence of expensive construction that isolated its occupants from the urban machinery operating 40 floors below. But somewhere in the guest wing, Willa was presumably still sleeping with the absolute commitment that children bring to unconsciousness before the world teaches them to wake with anxiety already circulating through their bloodstream. Grayson had departed 2 hours earlier, claiming the need to conduct a final security assessment of Ashford Tower before the day's events commenced. His military training had reasserted itself over the past 3 days, transforming the patient janitor she had first encountered into something more focused and operational, a man whose capabilities had been temporarily stored in positions that did not require them, but could be retrieved when circumstances demanded. He had studied the building's systems with attention that exceeded anything the actual security personnel had demonstrated, identifying vulnerabilities that professional assessments had overlooked, and proposing countermeasures that drew on experience with threat environments far more hostile than corporate real estate. The plan they had constructed relied on controlled variables and predicted behaviors, assumptions about Preston Hale's desperation, and the methods he would likely employ to prevent the contract from being finalized. They expected him to target the server room where evidence of his sabotage resided alongside documentation that the legal team would require if prosecution became possible. They had positioned additional security around that location personnel whose loyalties Margot had verified through channels that Vivian had not inquired about too closely. They believed they were prepared for the confrontation that Preston's increasingly desperate situation would eventually require him to initiate. They had not anticipated that Preston would change his approach entirely. The call arrived at 7:43, interrupting Vivian's preparation for the day, with the particular urgency that emergency communications carry, regardless of the specific content they contain. Grayson's voice reached her through the connection with control that she recognized as the sound of someone suppressing panic through training that refused to permit its expression. They have Willa. Preston's people took her from the penthouse 20 minutes ago. They must have had access codes we did not know about. The words assembled themselves into meaning that her mind initially refused to accept the information, contradicting assumptions about safety that the penthouse's security systems had seemed to guarantee. How the question emerged as barely more than whisper, her voice failing to provide volume that circumstances seemed to demand. I do not know. Grayson's response carried the particular flatness that intense emotion produces when expression would compromise function. But they left a phone. Preston is on the other end. He wants to talk to you. The call transferred with the mechanical efficiency that modern telecommunications provided, without consideration for the human content being conveyed. Preston Hale's voice replaced Grayson's with smoothness that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation in anticipation of its eventual necessity. Miss Ashford, I apologize for the dramatic measures, but conventional approaches had not achieved the results I required. Where is she? Vivian's voice found strength in fury. That fear had initially suppressed anger, providing energy that shock had temporarily depleted. Safe for the moment. Preston's tone carried the particular confidence of someone who believed he had achieved positional advantage that could not be easily overcome. She is an extraordinary child, actually. Very calm for someone in her circumstances. Her father's training, I assume. The mention of Grayson carried contempt that Preston did not bother to disguise dismissal of a man whose capabilities he had catastrophically underestimated. What do you want? The question was unnecessary but required articulation to move the conversation toward information that action would require. Two things. Preston's response suggested terms that had been calculated carefully before this moment arrived. First, you will sign a resignation letter that my attorneys have prepared, effective immediately. Second, the janitor will not appear at Ashford Tower today. He will not speak to investigators or provide testimony about anything he has observed regarding elevator systems or building maintenance. If both conditions are met, the girl returns to her father unharmed this evening. The terms landed with the weight of demands that contain no room for negotiation ultimatums, rather than opening positions. And if we refuse, Vivian heard herself asking the question that circumstances required, even though the answer was already apparent. Then the girl does not return at all. Preston's voice carried no heat, simply the flat statement of consequences he was prepared to implement. I have invested too much in this outcome to permit sentiment to compromise it now. You have until the contract signing to decide. If you appear at that ceremony, if the janitor appears at Ashford Tower, if anyone contacts law enforcement before this is resolved, my associates have instructions that I would prefer not to describe in detail. The call ended before Vivian could respond, the connection severing with finality that left her holding a device that suddenly felt inadequate to the situation it had just conveyed. Willow was gone, taken by men whose methods had already demonstrated themselves through the attack on the street that now seemed like preliminary reconnaissance for the operation that had just been executed. The child who had asked to call her mother had been weaponized against the people who had allowed themselves to love her, transformed from person into leverage, by a man whose desperation had apparently exceeded the moral boundaries that most people could not cross regardless of pressure. Her phone rang again within seconds, Grayson's name appearing on the display with urgency that the previous call had established as the morning's dominant register. I am coming back to the penthouse. Do not do anything until I get there. Do not call the police. Do not contact anyone. Just wait. His voice carried command rather than request authority that circumstances seemed to have granted him without formal delegation. She waited, the minutes stretching into duration that anxiety transformed into something approaching eternity. The penthouse felt different now. Its security compromised, its promise of protection revealed as illusion that sophisticated access codes and hired personnel could not actually provide. Someone had entered this space and taken a child while that child's father was conducting security assessments elsewhere, a timing that suggested surveillance more comprehensive than they had detected and planning more thorough than they had anticipated. Grayson arrived with the particular energy of someone whose emotional state was being channeled entirely into operational focus, panic converted into motion that purpose could direct. His face showed nothing of the terror that must have been circulating through his system, the training that had prepared him for worse situations than this, apparently sufficient to contain responses that would not serve his daughter's recovery. We are not going to let them win. His voice carried conviction that circumstances seemed to contradict, but that his manners somehow made credible. I know how to find her. I know how to get her back. But I need you to trust me. What do you need? Vivian's response contained no hesitation commitment, offered without the deliberation that major decisions usually required. Margot's contact in IT, the one who has been tracking Preston's communications. I need access to location data for his phone and the phones of the men who took Willa. If they were smart enough to use burners, I need traffic camera access for the routes leading away from this building. I need to know where they went. The requests were technical, but specific, the vocabulary of intelligence gathering that his military experience had apparently included. Vivian contacted Margot, immediately relaying requirements that her assistant processed without questions about their origin or purpose. The information began arriving within minutes. Data streams that Grayson absorbed with attention that suggested he was constructing a picture from fragments that would have overwhelmed observers without his training. Brooklyn. His voice carried certainty that the data apparently supported. They took her to a warehouse near the waterfront. 3 vehicles, 4 men arrival approximately 40 minutes ago. He looked up from the screen with eyes that contained calculation, rather than the emotion that fathers were supposed to display when their children faced danger. I need to go. Now, you need to stay here and prepare for the contract signing. The contract signing. Vivian's disbelief found expression in repetition that demanded explanation. You want me to proceed with the ceremony while your daughter is being held hostage by a man who will kill her if we do not comply with his demands. Grayson moved to stand directly in front of her, his hands finding her shoulders with grip that communicated urgency through pressure rather than words. Listen to me. Preston expects us to be paralyzed. He expects you to resign and me to disappear, and his plan to succeed because we care too much about Willa to risk her. But if you do not appear at that signing, he wins. If the contract falls apart, he achieves everything he has been working toward. And once he has what he wants, there is no guarantee he releases Willa anyway. She becomes a liability, a witness, someone who can identify the men who took her. The logic was brutal but coherent strategic assessment that required setting aside emotional responses that every instinct was demanding. Vivian felt the truth of his analysis even as everything human in her rebelled against its implications. You are going after her. The statement contained recognition rather than question, acknowledgement of intentions that he had not explicitly declared, but that his preparations had clearly indicated. I am going to bring my daughter home. His voice carried promise that exceeded the words, conveying a commitment that his entire being was mobilizing to fulfill. And you are going to buy me time by proceeding exactly as if nothing has happened. Preston will be watching the tower. When you appear for the signing, he will believe his demands are being ignored. He will contact his people to implement his threats. But by then, I will already be there. He kissed her forehead with tenderness that contradicted the violence his next hours would require, then departed through doors that closed behind him with the particular finality of moments that might not permit return. Vivian stood alone in the penthouse that had promised safety and delivered betrayal, her mind struggling to process divergent demands that circumstances were simultaneously imposing. She needed to prepare for the most important business ceremony of her career. She needed to project confidence that she did not feel. She needed to trust that a man she had known for weeks could accomplish what he had just promised, rescuing his daughter from professional criminals in a location she could not verify through methods she could not observe. The warehouse occupied space in a section of Brooklyn where industrial activity had retreated and redevelopment had not yet arrived, buildings whose original purposes had been abandoned, along with the economic conditions that had made those purposes viable. Grayson approached through routes that surveillance would not easily monitor his movements, drawing on skills that civilian life had not required, but that his body had retained regardless of conscious effort to maintain them. He had done this before in locations far more hostile than abandoned American industrial facilities, against opponents far more dangerous than corporate executives in their hired security. The men holding his daughter did not know who they were dealing with. They believed they had taken leverage from a janitor. They would discover their error shortly. The building's exterior revealed 3 entry points in an unknown number of occupants, variables that tactical planning required him to estimate rather than confirm. He moved through loading dock doors that rust had compromised years before their intended lifespan, concluded his feet finding paths that minimized sound production, his eyes adjusting to interior darkness that abandoned infrastructure had provided without intention. The voices reached him before visual confirmation became possible, men discussing matters that surveillance protocols would have prevented, but that their confidence in the situation had apparently rendered unnecessary. The kid is quiet, at least. The observation carried irritation rather than concern, complaint about operational inconvenience, rather than recognition of a child's terror being forcibly contained, probably scared silent. A second voice responded with dismissal that suggested limited experience with children or their emotional processes. Father should have thought about that before he got involved in things that did not concern him. Grayson moved towards the voices with patience that urgency would have compromised if he had permitted it to influence his actions. Each step brought him closer to the room where his daughter was being held, closer to the confrontation that would determine whether this day ended with reunion or outcomes he refused to allow his mind to formulate. He counted the voices and estimated their positions, constructing a mental map of the space that would guide his actions once initiative became his to seize. The room materialized from darkness as his eyes completed their adjustment to diminished illumination. 4 men occupied positions that training might have optimized, but that casual confidence had distributed according to convenience rather than tactical advantage. Willa sat in a corner on a chair that someone had apparently provided as minimal accommodation for a captive whose cooperation they required, but whose comfort they did not prioritize. Her eyes were open but fixed on something internal rather than external, the 1,000-yard stare that trauma produces in those experiencing it for the first time. She did not see him enter the room through shadows that the men guarding her had not thought to illuminate. She did not see him neutralize the first guard with the particular efficiency that combat training had embedded in his muscle memory beyond the reach of conscious thought. She did not see the second and third guards recognize his danger too late to respond effectively, their confidence in numerical superiority having prevented them from maintaining the alertness that might have provided warning. By the time her eyes focused on the present moment, rather than the internal landscape where terror had temporarily relocated her, her father was standing among unconscious men with extended hand and expression that somehow combined professional completion with emotional desperation barely contained. Willa. His voice carried her name like a prayer that had finally been answered after doubt had nearly extinguished the faith that had sustained it. I am here. You are safe now. We are going home. The child launched herself from the chair with velocity that suggested springs released after prolonged compression, her small body colliding with his with force that would have knocked someone less prepared off balance. Her arms wrapped around his neck with grip strength that suggested she would not voluntarily release him under any circumstances the foreseeable future might present, and the sounds emerging from her throat contained relief and terror, and the particular gratitude of someone who had believed rescue was possible but had not been certain until the moment had arrived. I knew you would come. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder, but carried clarity that the physical obstruction could not entirely suppress. I was scared, but I knew. I told myself you would come, and you came. Always. The single word carried promise that exceeded its brevity, commitment that his entire life would now be organized to fulfill. I will always come for you. He carried her from the warehouse through paths that the unconscious guards would not be reporting, his phone already connecting to Vivian with information that her morning had been designed to provide. I have her. She is safe. Proceed with the signing. I will meet you at Ashford Tower within the hour. The relief that flooded through Vivian's system nearly compromised the composure that the ceremony would require, emotion threatening to overwhelm the professional mask that circumstances demanded she maintain. She allowed herself 30 seconds to process the news. 30 seconds during which everything that had been suspended awaited permission to resume, then forced her attention back to the presentation that several hundred people would soon be assembling to witness. The contract signing had been scheduled for the main conference facility on the 42nd floor, the same level where Vivian had nearly died in an elevator that Preston Hale had sabotaged. The symbolism was not lost on her return to the scene of attempted murder, transformed into venue for the triumph that her survival had made possible. International partners had arrived from time zones that made their presence costly, board members occupied seats that their influence had assigned them, and press representatives documented proceedings that would generate coverage affecting stock prices and competitive positioning across multiple industries. Vivian took the podium with composure that concealed operations still unfolding in Brooklyn, her voice projecting confidence that internal turmoil did not actually support. The speech she delivered covered strategic vision and partnership benefits, and the future that this agreement would enable words that her preparation had made automatic, and that her mind recited while attention remained fixed on information that her phone might deliver at any moment. Preston Hale occupied a seat in the third row, his presence presumably intended to monitor compliance with demands that he believed were being ignored. His expression shifted through variations of concern as the ceremony progressed according to schedule recognition, gradually dawning that Vivian's appearance contradicted the resignation he had demanded. He reached for his phone with urgency that decorum prevented him from fully expressing, communications presumably being attempted with associates who were not responding because consciousness had been removed from their operational capabilities. The signing proceeded with the mechanical precision that legal formality required, signatures transferring across documents that attorneys had negotiated through months of revision and counter-revision. Vivian's pen moved through motions that had been rehearsed, but that felt different, now weight added by knowledge of what this completion represented beyond its commercial significance. Preston Hale was watching her with expression that had transformed from confidence through confusion into something approaching desperation, his leverage evaporating with each official stamp that confirmed agreements his sabotage had failed to prevent. He left his seat while the final documents were being witnessed, his departure observed but not prevented by security personnel who had no instructions regarding his detention. Vivian caught Margot's eye across the room and received the slight nod that confirmed contingencies were being implemented, plans that Preston's movements had now triggered into active operation. The server room on the 35th floor contained evidence that could destroy him, records that Margot had backed up but whose originals remained vulnerable to the desperate measures that a desperate man might attempt. Grayson arrived at Ashford Tower 37 minutes after departing the Brooklyn warehouse. Willis safely delivered to security personnel whose instructions included protecting her with methods that exceeded conventional protocols. He entered through service access that his previous employment had made familiar, his movements tracked by Margot's monitoring systems and reported to positions that would require his presence once Preston committed to the actions that cornered men typically attempted. The server room occupied space on the 35th floor that climate control maintained regardless of external conditions, equipment too valuable for temperature variations to be permitted to affect. The door stood slightly open when Grayson approached invitation or oversight that required investigation, regardless of which interpretation proved accurate. He entered with the caution that military training had established as automatic response to uncertain environments, his body positioning itself for contingencies that his mind was simultaneously calculating. Preston Hale stood among server racks with a laptop connected to systems he should not have been able to access, his fingers moving across keys with the particular focus of someone executing procedures they had practiced in anticipation of moments that planning had been designed to enable. A second figure occupied space near the room's emergency exit, younger than Preston, and holding equipment that suggested technical rather than security functions, presumably the specialist, whose skills had made the sabotage possible and whose continuing involvement was required for its completion. "You should have stayed fired." Preston's voice carried resignation rather than threat, observation rather than challenge. His attention remained fixed on the laptop screen where commands were presumably being executed. "You should have taken the girl and disappeared to somewhere we would not have found you. You could have had a life. You should have stayed honest." Grayson's response drew a line under moral distinctions that Preston's actions had eliminated any ambiguity about. "But I suppose that was never really an option for you." Preston finally looked up, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had invested everything in outcomes that were now visibly collapsing. "I was supposed to run this company. Richard promised me. 20 years of service, 20 years of building what his daughter was handed without earning any of it. And then he dies and leaves everything to a woman who did not know what she was doing, who needed 3 years to learn what I had understood since before she graduated business school. So you decided to take what you believed you deserved." Grayson moved further into the room, his positioning calculated to restrict Preston's exit options while maintaining distance from the technical specialist whose role in the current situation remained unclear. "I decided to correct an injustice." Preston's voice carried conviction that his circumstances somehow failed to undermine. Vivian Ashford would have destroyed this company eventually. Her father knew it, I knew it. Everyone who had been here long enough to understand knew it. I was trying to save something that matters from someone who does not deserve it. By killing her, the question carried the weight of attempted murder that Preston's rationalizations could not obscure. The elevator was supposed to be empty when it failed. Preston's response contained defensiveness that suggested even he recognized the inadequacy of this justification. She was supposed to use a different elevator that day. The janitor interfering changed everything. The janitor interfering saved her life. Grayson felt the particular satisfaction of being underestimated by someone whose plans had been constructed around that underestimation. The janitor recognized sabotage that your people thought was invisible. The janitor pulled her from the elevator, your modifications destroyed. The janitor is going to make sure you answer for everything you have done. Preston moved with desperation that his strategic position no longer supported his body launching toward the door with velocity that surprise might have made effective against observers less prepared for sudden movement. Grayson intercepted him with the efficiency that 12 years of combat training had established as reflexive response, his grip finding pressure points that martial arts had identified centuries before medical science confirmed their effectiveness. Preston collapsed with the particular helplessness of someone whose physical capabilities had been abruptly removed from his voluntary control, his face pressing against floor tiles that had been installed to support equipment rather than accommodate defeated executives. The technical specialist made his own attempt at escape his route, taking him toward the emergency exit that his positioning had been designed to access. He reached the door before Grayson could intercept him, his hands pressing against release mechanisms that should have permitted departure from the scene of crimes he had helped to enable. The door opened onto Vivian Ashford, flanked by security personnel, whose presence in the corridor transformed escape route into containment area. The police arrived with the efficiency that crimes involving prominent corporations and detailed evidence typically produce their procedures, establishing chains of custody for documents that Margot had organized in formats that prosecutors would later describe as remarkably convenient for their purposes. Preston Hale was led from the building in restraints that his expensive suit somehow made more incongruous. His departure documented by press representatives who had attended the contract signing and discovered that their coverage would extend to matters beyond commercial agreements. Vivian found Grayson in the bathroom adjacent to the server room, his arm bleeding from a wound that the confrontation had apparently produced despite the apparent ease with which he had neutralized the threats. She took the bandage from his hands without requesting permission, her fingers finding the injury with gentleness that contradicted the authority she typically projected in professional contexts. "You could have died." The words emerged with the particular intensity that suppressed emotion produces when it finally finds outlet. "So could you." His response carried symmetry that circumstances had repeatedly demonstrated. "We keep saving each other. Maybe that means something." She looked up from the wound she was wrapping, her eyes finding his with directness that felt more intimate than physical contact might have provided. "Why do you keep saving me?" The question contained genuine confusion, uncertainty about motivations she could not fully comprehend. "Because somewhere along the way you became mine to save." His voice carried truth that exceeded the words conveying it. "Mine to protect, mine to—" He paused, uncertainty briefly appearing in features that had displayed only confidence since she had known him. "Mine to love." Vivian completed the sentence he had hesitated to finish, her voice soft but steady. "Yes." She kissed him then, and the contact was nothing like the desperate rescue breathing in the stairwell where their physical connection had first been established. This was warm and voluntary and full of promise that circumstances had been building toward without either of them fully acknowledging its development. When they separated, both of them were smiling, with the particular expression of people who had discovered something valuable in locations they had not thought to search. The contract signing's official conclusion required Vivian's return to the ceremony, that Preston's arrest had interrupted formalities, that the morning's events had transformed from celebration into something more complex. She took the podium for the second time that day with composure that now contained authentic confidence rather than performed assurance, her voice addressing the assembled witnesses with honesty that her previous communications had not entirely achieved. 3 weeks ago, I made a terrible mistake. The opening captured attention that the morning's drama had already secured. I fired a man for trying to save my life. I was so consumed with appearing strong that I forgot what actual strength looks like. She paused, letting the words settle over an audience that had not expected confession from someone whose authority had always seemed absolute. Strength is not refusing help. Strength is accepting it. Strength is admitting when you are wrong and working to be better. Strength is recognizing that the walls we build to protect ourselves can become the prisons that prevent us from living. Her gaze found Grayson standing at the back of the room with Willa on his shoulders so the child could see over the assembled adults. The man she had dismissed as beneath her notice had proven himself more capable and more essential than anyone whose credentials she had previously valued. Grayson Mercer was a janitor in this building. I treated him as invisible as someone who existed to serve without deserving acknowledgement or respect. But he is also a decorated veteran who served his country for 12 years. He is a rescue specialist whose skills saved my life when professional emergency responders could not arrive in time. He is a devoted father whose love for his daughter motivated him to accept work that did not utilize his capabilities because that work allowed him to be present for her in ways that more demanding positions would have prevented. And he is the man who saved my life twice. Once with his breath and once with his courage to stand up when everyone else stood by. The room had grown silent with the particular attention that genuine confession commands, recognition that something authentic was being shared rather than something calculated for effect. Today, I am announcing that Grayson will be joining Ashford Industries' leadership team as our new Director of Technical Safety. His job will be to make sure no one in this building is ever ignored when they raise safety concerns. To make sure every voice matters regardless of job title. To make sure we value competence over credentials, character over corner offices. The applause began with the international partners and spread through the room with velocity that suggested the message had connected with something the audience recognized as true. Grayson looked stunned, his expression suggesting that the announcement had surprised him, despite the conversations that had preceded it. Willa bounced on his shoulders with enthusiasm that made her precarious position even more unstable. Her voice cutting through the formal atmosphere with the particular clarity that children's declarations possess. That is my daddy. The ceremony concluded with the signatures and photographs that corporate occasions required, documentation that would be filed and referenced and eventually forgotten by everyone except the archivists, whose job descriptions included maintaining such records. The crowd dispersed through exits that security had now fully secured their departure, monitored by personnel, whose alertness had been significantly enhanced by the morning's events. Willa slid down from her father's shoulders as the room emptied her approach toward Vivian, carrying the particular determination that the child displayed when she had reached conclusions she intended to share. Her expression held the seriousness that preceded important communications, the look that Grayson had learned to recognize as indication that his daughter was about to say something that would require thoughtful response. "Can I ask you a question?" Willa's voice carried formality that she had apparently absorbed from the ceremony's atmosphere. Vivian lowered herself until their eyes were level, the position that she had learned facilitated communication with someone whose perspective operated from significantly reduced elevation. "Of course, sweetheart. My mommy died." Willa's words carried the matter-of-fact quality that children sometimes achieve when discussing losses that adults find too painful for direct reference. "I do not remember her very much. But Daddy says she was kind and smart and loved me very much." Vivian nodded, not trusting her voice to contribute words that might interrupt the flow of whatever the child was building toward. "And you are kind and smart," Willa continued, her voice maintaining its careful pace. "And I think you love me too." Willa took a visible breath, the kind that children take when preparing to say something they have been considering for longer than the current moment suggests. "Could you maybe be my mom? Not instead of my mommy, just also." The question landed with weight that its simple construction did not prepare listeners to expect a child's directness, cutting through complications that adults would have surrounded with caveats and qualifications. Vivian felt tears forming that she did not attempt to conceal, moisture tracking down cheeks that had rarely cried in years, for reasons that seemed inadequate compared to the emotion now demanding expression. She pulled Willa into an embrace that communicated what words might have failed to convey, her arms wrapping around the child who had somehow stolen her heart while she was busy trying to protect it from connections that might complicate the life she had constructed. The girl who had fixed broken radios and asked impossible questions and declared her Ice Queen status with innocent accuracy had become someone Vivian could not imagine living without. I would be honored. Her voice emerged as whisper that the emotion reducing it to that register somehow made more rather than less convincing. So incredibly honored. Grayson joined them, his arms encompassing both figures in a circle that felt less like embrace than like the establishment of something permanent, the physical expression of a family that was being formed from components that previous circumstances had prepared without any of them recognizing the preparation's purpose. Vivian looked up at him through tears that continued falling without any apparent intention to stop. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, but were all she could manage. For breathing life into me in every possible way. Thank you for letting me. His response carried reciprocity that the word's symmetry reinforced. For opening your door. For letting us in. Willa looked up at both of them with expression that suggested the emotional intensity of the moment had reached limits that her 7-year-old capacity for such things could sustain. Does this mean I get to live in the penthouse? Their laughter echoed through the empty conference room, the sound-filling space that had witnessed corporate negotiations and hostile takeovers, in the particular variety of combat that business conducted with weapons other than the kind Grayson had been trained to operate. But this sound was different, warmer and more genuine than anything those walls had previously contained. The noise that families make when they discover each other and recognize what the discovery means. 6 months later, Ashford Tower continued its operations under leadership that had been transformed by events that most people who worked there understood only through the versions that corporate communications had authorized for distribution. The full story contained elements that legal proceedings had made public and elements that privacy concerns had kept confidential, the complete picture known only to those who had lived through its development and chosen to share its details with each other rather than with the wider world. A photograph occupied space on Vivian's desk that similar objects had never claimed before, an image captured at their wedding 3 months ago. The ceremony had been small by the standards that her social position might have demanded attendance limited to people whose presence actually mattered, rather than people whose exclusion might have caused professional complications. Willa had served as flower girl with the particular intensity that she brought to every task. She accepted her distribution of petals along the aisle, executed with precision that suggested engineering principles applied to botanical decoration. Margot had served as maid of honor with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did. Grayson occupied an office 3 doors down from hers, the position that his new title required, and that his capabilities had proven more than adequate to fulfill. The director of technical safety had implemented protocols that the company's insurance providers had praised, and its employees had welcomed systems that ensured concerns would be heard regardless of who raised them and from what position in the organizational hierarchy they emerged. Willa had transferred to a school closer to the penthouse that had become home, her adjustment to the new environment facilitated by social skills that her intelligence and curiosity made naturally effective. She had established herself as the student who fixed electronics that others had abandoned her room at the penthouse containing the workshop that Vivian had commissioned as welcome gift. Grayson appeared in her office doorway, Willa's hand in his, their presence announcing the conclusion of another workday and the beginning of the evening that their family would share. The child carried a device she had been constructing from salvaged components, something that beeped and blinked with purposes that she would explain in detail if given the opportunity. Ready to go home? Grayson's voice carried the particular warmth that he reserved for moments when professional contexts yielded to personal ones. Vivian rose from the desk that her father had believed would destroy her, moving toward the family that she had never expected to acquire and now could not imagine existing without. Always. They departed through doors that closed behind them with the soft click of conclusion that the day's work had earned the elevator, carrying them toward the lobby where their journey had begun in confrontation and would continue in connection that neither had anticipated when a janitor stepped in front of a CEO and refused to let her destroy herself. And it had all started with a kiss that saved a life and opened a heart that had forgotten how to love.